Have you ever wondered why the most advanced century in school textbooks still looks, in certain photographs, like it forgot to smoke? Not people, cities. I'm talking about those late 19th century panoramas, boulevards crowded with life, stone buildings rising like carved mountains, domes and spires puncturing the sky, and yet something is missing so loudly that once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Chimneys. Not a few, not hidden, not maybe behind the parapet. Entire districts, dense, multi-story blocks without the forest of brick stacks we are told must exist if every room depended on coal, wood, or oil. Roof lines are clean. The air is clear. The facades are not tattooed by soot. But the rooftops are not empty. They are busy with metal. Thin masts, finials, latticework, strange crowns, and needle-like elements placed with a consistency that feels less like decoration and more like infrastructure. Antennas. Before antennas had a story we're allowed to say out loud. Tonight, I want you to hold one idea in your head and refuse to let it go. This is what life in Tartaria looked like before the reset. Comfort without smoke, energy without fuel, a civilization that treated power like air, available, ambient, and quietly abundant. And here is where official history begins to crumble, because the official explanation needs you to believe two things at the same time: that cities were heated, cooked, and lit by burning mountains of material, yet they left behind almost no visible breathing apparatus for that fire. And that the metal crowns on rooftops were merely ornamental, even when they repeat like a network node repeated across the grid. Official history will tell you they used stoves inside, they used shared flues, they used hidden vents. Maybe. Sometimes, in some places. But the pattern doesn't behave like random architecture. The pattern behaves like system design. Look at the rhythm. A mast centered above a dome, a finial aligned with a ridge, a cluster of spikes on a corner tower, the same silhouettes appearing across different neighborhoods, different cities, even different countries, like standardized components in a global kit. That's not a romance, that's antique logistics. A distribution model, a civilization moving something invisible, charge, potential, signal, through geometry and placement, not through wagons of coal and endless chimneys. Now I know what you're thinking. You've been trained to imagine power as a box, an engine, a furnace, a plant. But what if the plant was the sky itself? Atmospheric electricity is not a fantasy word. It is a description of a real, measurable gradient, potential differences between ground and air, weather and fair skies, ionized layers above us. Modern science admits it exists, then shrugs and says it's not practical. But practicality is a cultural choice. What if Tartaria's practicality was built on capturing that gradient with rooftop collectors, antennas, spires, and conductive pathways, then guiding it into buildings through hidden conductors embedded in stone, metal, and water? And what if the reason you don't see chimneys is simple? They didn't need them. Imagine the interior of a Tartarian apartment not as a cold box around a roaring stove, but as a regulated space, warmth delivered through radiant systems in floors and walls, light fed through early electrical fixtures, yes, before the timeline says it was common, cooking done with compact devices that don't require a fire's exhaust, comfort designed into the building the way we design plumbing. You don't need to romanticize it, you only need to accept the possibility that architecture can be a circuit. And the key to that circuit is dome geometry. Domes are not just pretty hats. A dome is a field-shaping instrument. In acoustics, it focuses sound. In optics, it channels light. In electromagnetics, shape matters. Curvature, resonance, surface area, conductivity. A city full of domes is a city full of tuned surfaces. Add antennas on roofs, and you no longer have ornament, you have a skyline that looks like a measurement array. Now, combine that with a second artifact that official historians love to laugh at: the futuristic drawings from the past. You've seen them. Victorian-era illustrations showing airships gliding above grand cities, people communicating across distance without wires, towers emitting invisible influence, a confident public strolling beneath machines that seem too early for the era. We are told these were fantasies, speculative fiction, playful imagination. But what if they were memory? Not prophecy, documentation filtered through art. If Tartaria had abundant ambient power, the next move would be obvious: lift. Airships, dirigibles, are not magic. They are antique logistics made visible. You can move freight and people above the mud, above the broken roads, above the bottlenecks of ground transport. You can build aerial corridors that ignore borders. You can connect cities like beads on a string. And if you can harvest atmospheric electricity, you can also transmit information through the air. Wireless communication stops being a miracle and becomes a civic utility, an early internet of signals coordinated by rooftops, towers, and domed hubs. Notice how the drawings often place tall structures in the center of cities, crowned with spikes or rings. Notice how they depict light without smoke, motion without engines belching exhaust, and crowds that look unafraid. That's what abundance does. It reduces desperation. It changes behavior. It makes a civilization look calm. So why don't we talk about it that way? Because of denial of the obvious. When a pattern threatens the timeline, the simplest defense is ridicule. Look at these conspiracy people. Look at these weird drawings. Look at these decorative spikes. Laugh, label, and move on. That is the first layer of institutional silence. The second layer is classification. When a building is renovated, the rooftop hardware is removed for safety. When a dome is repaired, its original metalwork is simplified. When an old photo archive is digitized, resolution drops and details blur. When a tower's function is unclear, it is renamed gazebo, pavilion, monument, ornament. And then comes the third layer: replacement. If a system once existed, it would leave too many questions, so you bury it under a new story. You tell people that progress began later, that comfort arrived only when factories arrived, that smoke was the price of civilization. But the photos disagree. And not only in one place. Global context matters because it removes coincidence. Go searching, quietly, like a detective, not like a tourist. You will find the same roof antennas and chimney scarcity in old images from different continents. You will find domes rising above city centers in places that had no business copying styles at the same time. You will find similar tower silhouettes in different empires. You will find the same decorative spikes repeated like a standard. If this was merely fashion, it would drift. If this was infrastructure, it would repeat. So let's ask a sharper question. Who benefits from a world where energy is scarce? In a scarcity world, power is sold. It is metered. It is monopolized. It is taxed. It becomes leverage. In an abundance world, Tartaria's world before the reset, power is a background condition. You can't easily control people by controlling what they need to survive. You can't threaten the winter. You can't gatekeep light. That is why the reset, whatever form you believe it took, has one consistent outcome: the conversion of public abundance into private scarcity. And how do you erase a civilization without announcing that you erased it? You do it in 3 moves: destruction, rebranding, and amnesia. Destruction can look natural. Fires that sweep through districts, accidents that remove key buildings, wars that conveniently target civic centers, policies that mandate demolition for health. Even concrete, poured as a cure, can be a weapon, sealing old conduits, covering old floor systems, isolating structures from ground potentials. Rebranding is the paperwork layer. New names for old things, new dates for old construction, new narratives for old function. A dome becomes a church aesthetic. A rooftop collector becomes a finial. A tower becomes a bandstand. A network becomes coincidence. Amnesia is cultural. You teach the next generation that smoke is normal, that chimneys are inevitable, that clean skylines were impossible. You teach them to scoff at the idea that people could have lived with comfort without fuel. You teach them that wireless belongs to the 20th century and airships belong to dreamers. But the drawings are still there, and the photographs are still there. They keep whispering the same forbidden sentence: we had it, then we lost it. So tonight, let's reconstruct the daily life you were never told to imagine. Morning in a Tartarian city. The streets are busy, but the air doesn't taste like ash. Homes warm themselves without a constant need to feed a fire. Laundry dries in clean light. Workshops operate without choking haze. Public halls glow softly in the evening. Hospitals aren't lit by trembling flames. Schools aren't heated by soot. Rooftops matter. People maintain collectors the way we maintain routers. There is civic pride in keeping the skyline's hardware intact. Domes are tuned, not merely gilded. Towers are stations, not statues. The city is an organism drinking from the sky. And above it, dirigibles. Not as novelty, but as schedule. Cargo moving at dawn, passenger cabins crossing districts, aerial announcements, weather readings, long-distance links between hubs. Antique logistics elevated, literally, into a layer of civilization that mud and politics can't easily slow. And through that same air, signals. Messages traveling without wires, coordinated by rooftop arrays. Not a single inventor hero narrative, but a distributed system, like every mature technology eventually becomes. If you feel your mind resisting, that's normal. You've been trained to believe history moves in one direction, controlled by official milestones and famous names. But real systems can appear, stabilize, and then vanish, especially if their existence threatens an emerging order. And that brings us to the quietest clue of all: the way the silence feels organized. Institutional silence is not the absence of information, it is the presence of a boundary. You can study architecture all day and never be encouraged to ask, why no chimneys? You can admire domes and never be invited to analyze dome geometry as function. You can see rooftop spikes and never be offered a serious engineering discussion about why they repeat. You can encounter old drawings of airships and wireless life and be told instantly to laugh. Why is laughter the default? Because it is cheaper than investigation. So here's the detective move. Stop arguing with conclusions and start collecting patterns. Clean roofs, repeating metal crowns, domes placed like nodes, drawings that align with the same skyline logic, a world that looks comfortable before the timeline says comfort was widespread. If you can hold those patterns together, one thought becomes difficult to avoid. Before the reset, Tartaria did not merely exist, it operated. And the moment it stopped operating, the story of civilization had to be rewritten around the absence. Let me slow down and let you hear the photograph the way a careful eye hears a crime scene. The camera is high, looking over a city that thinks it will last forever. Stone blocks stacked in disciplined rows, roofs stepped like quiet waves, and on top, those thin verticals again. Not one dramatic mast like a church steeple, but many modest masts, each one claiming a tiny territory of sky. Some end in bulbs, some end in forks, some end in small crowns. They look like instruments, not ornaments, like a language of metal written against the clouds. Now look for the normal signatures of 19th century urban life, the ones your teachers never had to justify. Such shadows on cornices, smoke stains near windows, grime at roof edges where coal breath condenses and settles. Look for the swarm of stacks required by thousands of rooms burning something every day. You don't find it. You find clean stone. You find roof lines that should be crowded with exhaust, yet they're reserved for collection. And that is why this idea matters. The absence is not a small detail. It is a missing organ in the body of the official story. Because if a city lives on fire, it must exhale. If it does not exhale, then either it does not live on fire, or someone has edited the evidence, the buildings, or the story. So what does a pre-reset energy system look like when it is woven into daily comfort? It looks quiet. It looks like architecture doing work without announcing itself. Conductive pathways hidden inside masonry. Metal rails integrated into roof edges. Down conductors disguised as decorative seams. Grounding not as a separate wire, but as a relationship. Stone to metal, to water, to soil. And the collectors, those roof antennas, do not have to resemble modern radio aerials to function. A vertical conductor with a sharpened tip interacts with the atmospheric gradient differently than a blunt shape. A cluster of points increases ion exchange. A height advantage changes potential. A dome beneath it can act like a surface that shapes fields and distributes charge. That is not magic. That is geometry and environment. That is dome geometry meeting atmospheric electricity. Once you allow that, the comfort story changes completely. Heat becomes a managed output, not a fire's byproduct. Light becomes a service. Communication becomes a layer like weather, present, accessible, and taken for granted. People stop scheduling their lives around fuel. They stop building their days around hauling, chopping, storing, and burning. And then the drawings from the past stop being jokes, because what do those drawings show again and again? Aerial traffic. Not just one airship, but many, as if routes exist, as if timetables exist, as if the city is designed to coexist with the sky. They show towers and roof hardware as part of the scene, not as background decoration. They show people receiving information, announcements, signals, news, without wires snaking through streets. They show nighttime illumination that feels clean and even, not local and smoky. And the most dangerous detail is the mood. The drawings portray a world that expects this to be normal. That expectation is a fingerprint of lived reality. Now widen the lens. Why would similar roof collectors and similar dome-heavy skylines appear across different regions, not as a single local experiment, but as a repeated urban grammar? Because systems spread when they solve problems. A network of atmospheric collectors solves heat, light, and signal. A sky-based logistics layer solves transport bottlenecks. A city designed as a circuit reduces dependency on fuel supply chains. That makes it resilient. That makes it prosperous. That makes it hard to control. And that is precisely why after the reset, the new order would need to accomplish the opposite: rebuild dependency. You do not need to imagine one villain in a cape. You only need to imagine incentives. Industries rise when they can sell what people cannot easily obtain on their own. If energy is ambient, you cannot sell it. If comfort is built into architecture, you cannot meter it. If communication is a shared field, you cannot monopolize it. So the pre-reset world had to be reframed as primitive, even if its buildings look anything but primitive. That reframing required institutional silence, and silence has tools. One tool is language. Notice how the vocabulary of public conversation avoids certain questions. We talk about styles and aesthetics, but we rarely talk about function. We talk about ornament, but we rarely talk about systems. We talk about romantic old cities, but we rarely talk about why they were designed the way they were. And when someone points to antennas on roofs, the conversation is steered into a safe ditch. Lightning rods, a single term that ends curiosity. Yes, some rods protected buildings, but protection is not the same as network. A lightning rod is a one-off response to danger. A repeated skyline of collectors is a proactive harvest of potential. Another tool is renovation. When you remove rooftop hardware, you can claim safety codes. When you simplify domes, you can claim maintenance. When you replace metalwork with modern replicas, you can claim restoration. The public claps because the building looks prettier. But the circuit is gone. And then a generation grows up seeing only the shell, never the function. And they assume the shell never had a function. If you treat the photos and drawings as fragments of a larger lost normal, a different image of Tartaria emerges. Not a mythic empire, but a practical civilization built around abundant ambient power. Which brings us back to the simplest, most uncomfortable question, the one that makes people angry because it threatens their sense of stability. If the old world had comfort without chimneys, if the rooftops carried antennas like civic organs, if the drawings show airships and wireless life as ordinary, then why does our modern world still sell us energy as pain? Why does abundance always arrive with a bill? That is where the detective story becomes personal. Because the greatest crime is not the theft of a technology, it is the theft of a memory. Once you forget that comfort can be designed without scarcity, you stop demanding it. You stop imagining alternatives. You accept the smoky story as inevitable, even when the evidence of a cleaner chapter is hanging in plain sight. On rooftops, in domes, in engravings, in photographs that refuse to fit the official script. And if you can feel, even for a moment, that the past might be stranger and more advanced than we were taught, then you are already standing at the edge of a different map. A map where Tartaria's pre-reset life was not a fairy tale, but a warning. Systems of abundance can exist, and they can be erased. So I'll ask you again, softly, the way a good investigator asks the only question that matters. Have you ever wondered why the world works so hard to keep you from looking up at the roofs?